This is a revision presentation on the basics of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. What I'm going to do in this presentation is take you through each of the three curves that make up this model and explain what causes shifts in these curves. Let's start with aggregate demand. So the key thing for the aggregate demand curve is the equation. AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The C stands for consumer spending, the I stands for investment, that's spending by businesses on capital goods, and the G is government spending. X minus M is then our net exports, X standing for exports and M standing for imports, our balance of trade. So it's changes in these components that lead to shifts in the aggregate demand curve. So you need to be familiar with the kind of things that would affect each of these. So consumer spending being affected by consumer confidence and the interest rate and things like that. Government spending perhaps being influenced by the size of the budget deficit. Changes in the components of aggregate demand will then lead to shifts in the aggregate demand curve. So for example, if one of the components increases, say an increase in investment from an increase in business confidence, the curve will shift out from AD1 to AD2, and what you can see that means is that any price level, there's a higher level of demand for goods and services throughout the whole economy. It's worth remembering though that we can also get movements along the aggregate demand curve. For example, if the price level increased in P1 to P2, we move to a lower level of aggregate demand. Now the reason why higher price level equals lower aggregate demand is because, for example, we'll have lower exports from the country because UK exports will be less competitive, and also it hurts people's real incomes. For the same level of income, you can't buy as much if the price level is higher. Then at the same time, if the price level was to fall to P3, then we'd see aggregate demand increase to Y3, for example, from increased exports from lower prices. So whenever we get a change in aggregate demand from a change in the price level, we'll see a movement along the aggregate demand curve. The short run aggregate supply curve, on the other hand, is all about the costs of production. That's the key three words for thinking about short run aggregate supply. The kind of things that would change the costs of production for firms in the economy would be price of raw materials, and in particular oil is something that comes up very often in multiple choice as something that will affect firms' costs and so shift the SRAS curve. The price of imports as influenced through the exchange rate. Wage costs, because of course wages are part of the productive process, and an increase in wages will mean that firms have to pay more to do production, and that will increase their costs. Increases in productivity will help reduce the costs of production, and low productivity will help increase the costs of production. And so it's exactly the same principle. Let's say we had some increase in costs. What we then get is a negative shift of the SRAS curve. At any price level now, firms can't produce as much as they did in the past. So increases in costs lead to negative shifts of SRAS. Reductions in cost would lead to positive shifts of short run aggregate supply, positive of course always meaning to the right. Finally, the long run aggregate supply curve. The long run aggregate supply curve, which reflects an economy's long run productive potential, is all about the four factors of production. So it's about the quantity and the quality of land, by which we really mean natural resources, labour, capital goods being the goods that are used to produce other goods like machinery, and enterprise, which means kind of new businesses and new innovative processes in production. So if we had some improvement in one of those factors of production, let's say our workers becoming more skilled led to a greater quality of labour, we then see a positive shift of the long run aggregate supply curve out from LRAS to LRAS2. Again, the principle is always the same. Positive shift is to the right, and the LRAS curve influenced by those four long run factors of production.